you know what? Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I want to have a mental illness and I want to be an alcoholic and a drug addict and really hurt my kids and have a lousy marriage and, struggle with my career my whole life because of it. Nobody gets up and does that, right? And so what began to arise in me as I worked the steps was empathy and compassion for him. Like, oh, you know what? This wasn't a choice on his part. And the way he treated me, it wasn't personal. It would have happened to anybody else who was born into the same situation, right? And I'm not giving him a hall pass for all the stuff that he did. All I'm saying is that I began to say, my dad was as sick as I am. And he was stumbling and doing the best he could with what he had. It wasn't much, but, that's the best thing he could come up with. And so what the steps do is it begins to defang a lot of our resentments and a lot of our pain and suffering in a way that brings peace and healing.
The uptick of mental health challenges is so evident, but for folks desperate for change, Ian, who have tried everything without effective results, what do you say? Like, why, I want to start here, why aren't our current therapeutic methodologies turning the key?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and I don't know if I can, speak globally for the whole, but I do believe that, so much of what we try to do to fix ourselves fails because it continues to rely on the juice of unaided willpower. And what we really need is, in my new book, The Fix, I actually tell a story about my son, Aiden, when he was 2 years old. And you will appreciate this because you've heard this story, right? He's in the bathtub. He's about 1.5 years, 2 years old. I realized I didn't have a towel. I run to the linen closet to grab one real fast. And when I got back, I discovered that Aiden had taken a epic poo in the tub, and it was kind of like Exxon Valdez level, and he realized that he had caused a disaster as well, and he had been picking it up, and then he realized it was on his hands, and so he wiped his hands on his hair, and then he wiped it on the tile, and by the time I get back, man, I'm worried about the harp seals and because it's like, oh my gosh, this is a disaster. Now, what happened was that Aiden had tried himself to fix himself, right? And what he discovered was that he needed someone outside of him to do for him what he could not do for himself. And so he had to rely on his dad to be the one who could take care of the problems in his life. And, I just find that dynamic in psychotherapy and in spiritual circles, that this idea that the unaided willpower has very little ability to deal with the internal distress that all of us have, and that we need to, as part of our healing, there has to be some kind of reliance on an outside power, I choose to call that power God, to extricate them from the problems that they have.
Let's back up. I mean, you so brilliantly probe and ponder as an interviewer, and I've just loved being a guest on Typology twice, but what I didn't know is what you are so candidly talking about right now. I've heard part of your story, you've shared it with me, but that specifically in the last few years, you felt like a fraud. And by 2020, you were hooked on prescription meds. Ian, take me back. What was happening?
Yeah, well, so I had enjoyed multiple decades of sobriety. I first got sober from alcohol in 1987. Periodically returned to the rooms, the 12-step communities that were supportive of me, but found myself in a really, really dark period, and returned to my addiction, and eventually ended up in treatment. I kept it private for the last 4 some years, almost 5 years. Because it's a private journey. I don't have to share everything with everybody, but I derived so much help from the 12 steps. And I was like, you know how it is for a writer, right? When the hair goes up on the back of your neck and the lump appears in your throat, and you're like, I got to write about this, because The 12 steps really are an amazing spiritual technology that is not only for people who are identified alcoholics or drug addicts, it's for everybody. And even Bill Wilson, the founder of AA and the author of the 12 Steps, said the 12 Steps could revolutionize anybody's life. I have seen its transformative power. It has saved the lives of millions of people. And whether your problem is people-pleasing or workaholism or, any other addictive pattern, all the way up to a substance abuse problem, the 12 steps will change your life.
I don't want to jump to the punchline too quickly because that is where we're headed today. But I think maybe for the sake of the listeners, give us a flyover of how the modality works. And then I want to sort of nuance and iron out some of the intricacies of it through your story.
Yeah. So first of all, let's just define what an addiction is, because one of the things I do in the book, one of the things I do is I make a bold statement, but I make it as a pastor, I make it as a therapist. I think everybody's an addict. It is just in the human condition. In fact, in the book, I quote the great Christian psychiatrist Gerald May, who says, "To be human is to be addicted, and to be human and addicted is to stand in need of grace." So it's in our wiring, right? And I don't go into the neuroscience of addiction in the book. It's not my specialty. But I would define an addiction as an unhealthy, compulsive relationship with a person, a behavior, or a substance that has mood-altering effects and negative consequences. So, for example, let's say you're a workaholic. You just can't stop working, right? You derive your self-esteem from it. Every time you do it, it has a numbing, mood-altering effect that distracts you from the real pain and distress in your life, the real underlying causes and conditions of your workaholism. And you suffer negative consequences because you may be estranged from your children, your partnership with your spouse is suffering because, you're working 80 hours a week. And I've heard this story 1,000 times, and it's compulsive. And so what the 12 steps offer is a design for living that gets at the underlying causes and conditions of the addictive patterns in our lives and begins to bring about radical transformation and healing. And Chris, I got to tell you, man, I go to 12-step meetings 4 times a week easily. And not because I'm like desperate and like dying for a drink or a drug, that's not the reason. I go because they're fun. And every time I go, I hear something that blows my mind, often from the most unlikely of sources, right? And I have seen lives so dramatically changed that back when I was a pastor of a church, if I had seen that transformation in the sanctuary that I now see in the basements meetings of churches, right? I'd probably have stayed in the game a lot longer because of how satisfying it would have been.
What's the power of a secret then in isolation, in hiddenness? You're tipping your hat to healing in community. That's where these groups are facilitated. Yeah. But I'm curious, just to back out of this a little bit, what's the strength of a secret?
Yeah, well, it's a great question because, one of the things I say in the book is we get sick alone and we heal together. And, I think it's Gabor Mate who says, for as long as we hold on to a secret, we're at war with ourselves, right? Now, honestly, I'm a fairly private person, but, like, for example, on Instagram, when somebody starts sharing intimate details of private material with the world, I'm really uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Like I look at that and I think, okay, that's oversharing. But as my sponsor, and for listeners, a sponsor in a 12-step community is a person who's been doing it longer than you, has done the steps, is going to walk you through the steps and serve as an advisor going forward, right? As my sponsor, who I love and reference in the fix quite a bit, he likes to say to me, Ian, not everybody needs to know everything about you, but at least one person does, right? Because secrets have a corrosive effect, and they feed on themselves. And so they're a little bit like mildew, right? They grow in the dark. And they have a way of not only undermining our spiritual health, they have a way of making us feel alienated and separate from other people and from ourselves and from God, right? So we really have to be about the business of stewarding those secrets in such a way that they no longer control our lives from the shadows.
Do you think stewarding our secrets, I love that phrase, has to do with breaking down the trust structures of addiction itself? Like, if we were to walk back into this, Ian, what's in the anatomy of addiction? What's the scaffolding that builds it, makes it work, and holds it up?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that question. Mm-hmm. And to be very clear, addictions are very complicated processes. They often have genetic components, they have social components, they have familial origins, it's very, very complicated. The brain science of addiction is very complicated. Our brain is actually kind of wired for them. Whatever releases dopamine and gives us a feeling that kind of relieves or numbs our distress, even at low levels. Once that gets going, we get into a relationship with a person, a behavior, or a substance that, is an external solution to an internal problem. And whenever you have an external solution to an internal problem, it's like going to the hardware store to buy bread. It's ultimately you're going to the wrong place to try and get something that will eventually take over your life and hijack it. So, I mean, for me, like I said, I mean, addictions are complicated, but I think everybody can relate to this idea that we all have addictive patterns. And though yours might not be to alcohol or to substances, you definitely have behaviors and relationships with, people or things that you use to self-medicate, to soothe yourself, that eventually, that start off as a well-intentioned solution. You know what I'm saying? Like to pain.
Yeah.
But eventually the solution becomes a bigger problem than the problem it was trying to solve.
Why? Those are your words. In fact, I grabbed this quote from your book, The Fix. Our self-written prescriptions for soothing our pain eventually cause us more problems than they solve. What's underneath the hood of that? Why?
Well, I mean, again, part of it is just how the brain works. And part of it is how the human spirit works. All of us, our ego would like us to believe we're in a lot more control of our lives than we actually are. And we're always trying to find a fix that feels like it's self-created, rather than turning to a source that can ultimately take care of us. But that involves, faith and patience.
Let's go to self-doubt. I think about self-doubt, and you talked about this in your book as well. In your case, Ian, did self-doubt ever turn into self-hatred?
Oh, sure.
How?
I mean, I think all of us struggle with, and maybe another way of talking about self-hatred is to talk about shame. Because often self-contempt often shows up as shame, right? The feeling of not enough. I'm just not enough. And there's something fundamentally flawed with my essential self. And therefore I, have to find ways to medicate that, to prove it wrong, whatever it is, right? So I think one of the things that the 12 steps does beautifully is it interrupts the circuit on shame and gets it to stop looping inside, where it causes a lot of heartache.
Play that out for me. If I think about the inciting moment of shame where that narrative starts to get written, perhaps for a lot of us early in life, talk to me how that works in the opposite way through 12-step process.
Yeah, so, when you look at the steps, and we can go through them if you like, but
when
you look at steps 1 through 3, it's really about mending your relationship with God as you understand God. Then 4 through 7 is about mending your relationship with yourself. Then 8 and 9 is about mending your relationship with others. And then steps in 10 through 12 are really about developing a lifestyle that supports health and growth in each of those domains of your life moving forward. So it's a really wonderful, simple, not easy path to walk to what, we call wholeness, and towards, a pattern of living that is, will transform your life into one that feels purposeful and useful.
Nuance mending our relationship with God. I think at the outset, folks might think, yeah, that's me receiving or seeking forgiveness, and that's part of it. But I would dare to think there's probably more. There's more to that story.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot more to that.
Tell me what's involved in that.
Yeah, so, the first step is we admitted we were powerless. The original would be over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. You could insert whatever your addiction of choice is, right, in there, right? So we admitted we were powerless over the need over people pleasing, that our lives as a result had become unmanageable, right? And then the second step is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And the third one is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. So here what we have is the spiritual principle of honesty at work. It's like we just come to this place in our life where we look at ourselves and our situation and we say, I'm out of ammo. So let's say you feel powerless over one of your children who's acting out in dangerous ways, and you've done everything in your power to control them, manipulate them, get them to change, do something different. And, but they're 22 years old and it's not working. And it's making your life unmanageable, right? So you reach this point where you go, you know what? I'm powerless. I'm powerless over this person, and I'm actually in this codependent kooky relationship with them now, and it's a mess. And the more I try, the worse it gets. It's like Aiden in the bathtub again, right? And then finally you reach this point of just admitting powerlessness, which is not resignation, okay? It's just acknowledging what's true, right? I am powerless to keep my spouse in this relationship with me. Or I am powerless over, my porn addiction, or over my, sports betting. There's a list of addictions, or over my eating, or over, whatever it is that I'm doing to try and numb the distress I feel inside. What's weird, Chris, is that when you do that, you suddenly, it's odd, man, it's a paradox, but when you admit powerlessness, suddenly a new power flows into you. It's very strange. It's like this dilation in the chest. Suddenly everything inside just relaxes and goes, okay, now we got hope. I've given up my own power. And then just coming to believe that there is a power greater than you that could restore you to sanity, and then turning your will and your life over to the care of that power. And for me, that power is God. But I make space for people to, on their own journey toward discovering God, to start with something else for all I care, as long as they get going, right, on the path. And, for me, I just seen like overnight changes in people when they admit their powerlessness honestly and put in. So it's really a posture of surrender.
I love that you use that word. You and I talked about this earlier in the year on your show, and it might be worth just kind of rehashing a little bit, because in my own journey out of just chaos on the inside to a place of transformation, and of course we're all being transformed day by day. For me, surrender, to your words, surrender wasn't about giving up. It was giving in. I'm going, okay, here it is. I can't do anything. I surrender my proclivities. I surrender this. Therefore, I'm giving in willfully to a process of confrontation that, through my partnership, would lead to transformation.
Yes.
Is that a similar way of saying what you said?
So let's put it this way. Step one could be summarized this way. I can't. Step two is God can. Step 3 is I think I'll let him. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's pretty much that simple. I can't, God can. I think I'll let him, right? And one of the things I think we spoke about the last time we were together is I think so many people in the spiritual life mistakenly rely on the power of reformation, which is I'm going to change myself, by golly. I am going to grit my teeth. I'm going to grit my teeth. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to become the best Christian that ever lived. Right. And I'm going to do it on my own unaided willpower. Well, good luck with that. That's called reformation, and actually reformation is in direct opposition to grace. Okay? What we're looking for is transformation. And we confuse reformation and transformation all the time. Now, what is transformation? Transformation is what happens when you offer God consent to do in you what you cannot do for yourself. Okay? So now consent.
I'll let him.
I'll let him. And so now that sounds very passive, but it's not. And actually, as far as I'm concerned, whenever I meet, for example, a Christian who tells me, well, I'm just trying to be a good Christian, I'm like, well, then you don't get it. Right? Like, trying to be a good Christian is like, what? Like, actually, honestly, like, grace doesn't, actually, it's not opposed to trying. It's just opposed to earning. Right? So, yes, I cooperate. I try to suit up and show up every day and do my best. But ultimately, I know that I have to rely on a higher power for me. I call that higher power God. And I have to rely on God to do for me what I can't do for myself. And here's the amazing thing. Here's how you know that grace is working in your life. You'll know when suddenly you begin to witness transformation happening inside your heart and in your behaviors, right? Without you really doing anything. It's like suddenly you're just changing from the inside out, not the outside in. And it makes it's like, and then faith and the journey of spiritual transformation becomes such a surprising joy. And that's what the 12 steps offer to us.
Yeah, I want to hunker down on I'll let him. That is so profound because, Ian, I just wonder, we all hit this fork in the road where I can't, God can, but then the fork in the road is either I'll let him or I think I need to willpower my way through.
Yes.
Spiritual exercises,
Yep.
faith my way out of it.
Yep.
But when we miss I'll let him, we go back in the cycle of works of the flesh and frustration, right?
Yeah.
Striving.
Yeah, of course. And we've all been through this phase early on in our spiritual life probably, right? Oh, I just need more Bible study, or I need an accountability group, or I need more prayer, or I need to go out and evangelize people, or I need to do this, or I need to do more of that. And it's like, well, how about you just give up? How about if you just surrendered? And then, allow God to have access to your innermost self in such a way that he will begin to bring about these fruits in your life without a whole lot of effort on your part. Now, again, I know this all sounds very abstract to people that want things to do, right? But unfortunately,
this guy.
this is whether you like it or not, this is the gospel, right?
It's true.
And it is a lifelong effort to give God consent, to get the ego out of the way and to give God consent. And I unpack all of this in the fix, right? Like I just step by step break it down and help people see the path. And in the workbook, I try really hard to give people the tools to work through the steps.
Yeah, folks, I'll just take a TV timeout to say in the show notes at wintoday.tv, there's a link to get the fix, and I implore you to get it. Ian, I want to go back to that example, the story with Aiden as a little boy in the bathtub. And I want to set up a case study. So in that example, when there is a mess and his reflex is to try to fix himself, but it ends up causing a bigger mess, how does a good father respond in that? Obviously, you helped clean him up, but what does a good father do? And this is emblematic of, I think, our process of transformation. What does a good father do in equipping us to move beyond, to move forward, to learn, to grow? In other words, what did you do for Aiden in that circumstance that not only helped clean him up, but equip him for the next time that might happen?
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's a great question. And what I'm about to share with you, I have permission to share from Aiden, so no worries. So years later, let's fast forward, 18 years, Aiden developed a drug problem. He went to treatment 3 times before he finally surrendered, right? Finally gave up. And in that moment, we began to see a complete radical change in his character and in his life when he finally admitted powerlessness and got help, right? And what I was able to do in that season, because of what I know and what I've been through myself, was, I actually needed Aiden to suffer the consequences of his continuing to do things, trying to fix himself through drugs and alcohol. I had to actually remember in my heart that Aiden, first and foremost, is God's child, not mine. That's number one. Number two, I had to practice step three. I had to make a decision to turn Aiden and my life over to the care of God as I understood God, right? And it sounds very counterintuitive to parenting, and often parents keep jumping in and enabling a child in these situations. They're trying to fix a mess on their unaided willpower. They try to, go searching for the bottles, go looking for the drugs, get in the car late at night to go find their kid, whatever it is, right? And it's all well-intentioned, but really what Aiden needed me to do was to let go of him and allow God to do what God was going to do in his life, and to allow him to suffer the consequences of his choices. And so, that's just one example again of where the 12 steps really help, man. Like, they really help in a very practical, down to earth way. And again, I just want to remind listeners that this book is not just for people who are addicts and alcoholics. Actually, the subtitle says it all, right? How the 12 steps offer a surprising path of transformation for the well-adjusted, the down and out, and everyone in between. So it's not just for people out on the tails of extreme stuff happening in their lives. It's really a pattern of life that everybody can live. Even Bill Wilson, the author of the 12 Steps, said that these steps could revolutionize anybody's life, not just those of alcoholics. And I just really want everybody to really understand them and apply them to their lives and derive the same benefit from them that I have and that my son Aiden has, and countless other people.
I'd be curious to know your take on the role of a father. God is a good father. He's a good father, and he trains us, he matures us, etc. But I'd be curious your take on how your role in Aiden's life in that season was different from your wife Anne's, in your ability to mentor, to shape, to encourage, to challenge. Talk about the role of a father. Yeah.
So two things come to mind. One is I was really fortunate. I have an amazing wife of 38 years, and who I fall in love with more deeply every year. Thankfully, we were on the same page. My wife works a 12-step program through a community that is there for people that have spouses or kids or friends or relatives that are struggling or have struggled with addiction. And so she and I both worked that program, right? Like, we were working a program. So thankfully we weren't at loggerheads with each other with different ideas about what to do in that situation. We were a team. And that made us kind of immovable on some things. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is, I in the book, I talk a lot about the prodigal son, and I really believe that the goal in life, we tend, when we read the prodigal son, to always identify with the prodigal, right? Like, we always think, okay, that's what I am, right? Some people who are fairly wise or mature may also see themselves in the elder son, right? But ultimately, I think on the spiritual journey, the goal is to become the father in that story. The father who blesses and who waits and welcomes home the one that has, gone off and maybe is in doing stuff that is extreme or not so extreme, but is off the path. And so in some ways, that story to me is instructive. The father didn't run to go get the kid in trouble, right? Like he just waited at home, waited, prayed, waited, and trusting that ultimately that kid there would come a moment when he came to his senses, as it says, and came home. And that is available to everybody. And I think one of the things that I like to believe is that I have been the prodigal in my life before. But I think as you mature, you more and more identify and see the Father as your role model, to bless, to welcome, to receive without shame, without shaming people, and to say, and to throw a big party when that person comes home, right?
want to talk about the power of change and really the power of regret. I think about the moment change begins to happen through the lens of your work in the 12 steps, admitting that I'm powerless. I think about Dr. Henry Cloud. He says that we'll change when the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of making that change.
Yes.
Unpack that. Like, how'd that play out for you?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely true, right? It's called hitting your bottom. There comes this moment when you realize that my self-prescribed strategies for making life work, whether that's, watching porn, or it's, like I mentioned, people pleasing, or, succumbing to the fear of disappointing people, or workaholism, whatever your thing is, right? Or group of things is. Eventually, those things become more painful than the problem you're trying to solve, right? The solution becomes a bigger problem. And so I think the process of transformation does come with this realization that, okay, I'm out of good ideas. And in fact, all my old ideas are not working. And so you suddenly become open to the possibility of, someone else picking you up out of the bathtub and cleaning you up, right?
There it is. So in the process of change and in really dealing with the confrontation that this will involve, because change is painful.
It's scary.
And the pain of not changing, I think, is worse in the long run. But I think there are many of us who would be baited in the process of transformation to self-sabotage because we're like, oh, we don't like this. I'd love to learn more about how self-sabotage plays a role in our lives. As I said, so many of us really deeply desire wholeness, but somehow, back to your words, we end up burning our lives to the ground in pursuit of it. Why the disconnect, Ian? Why self-sabotage?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Sometimes with clients, I'll say, do you want change or do you just want pain relief?
Whoa, break that apart.
Well, sometimes we think what we want is change, but what we really want is something or somebody to take the pain away. We don't really want to do the deep inner work that's required to change, right? Which would then alleviate the distress. So, so oftentimes we could sort out good clients in therapy from bad ones, not bad ones, but ones who aren't ready, by just simply asking the question, what do you really want? Like, do you really want that? Or do you want me to put a Band-Aid on the problem and make the pain associated with the problem go away? Right. So it's like, that's an important moment in a person's life when they have to make a decision as to which they want. And when you get into the steps, so 1, 2, and 3, they're not, 1 and 2 are not action steps, right? They're just kind of like admitting you're out of ammo, you're powerless over whatever your drug of choice is or behavior of choice is. You've come to believe that a power greater than yourself can take care of it. Yeah, making a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God in step 3 is an action, but not a particularly strenuous one, right? But when you get to 4 and 5, which involve making a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself and then admitting to God, to yourself, and to another human being the exact nature of your wrongs, like now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty here, right? Now we're starting to dive into the work you have to do to find freedom from the ensnaring patterns in your life that are undermining you, right? That are, daily pulling the rug out from your wholeness. So, the steps are demanding. They're hard work. Thankfully, they're easy to understand. Anybody can get them, really. And they are also, they're like really proven to work. Like you are talking about in the past 80 years since they were written, 80 plus years, that they have literally changed the lives, saved in many cases the lives of millions upon millions of people. Like it is like, what blows my mind is that there aren't more books about the 12 steps for everyone, given how much they've changed lives before.
Were any one of the 12 more difficult for you, that you wrestled with more, that required more of you? Like, how did that play out with you? I'm actually not very familiar with the 12 steps, and I have learned so much through reading the fix and am just blown away by it all, but I'm just curious about your experience. Like, were there any one of the 12 steps that, like, shoot, this is going to take a little more?
Yeah. So for example, steps 8 and 9 were super hard, right? Not so much 8. 8 is made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Okay, well, I can make a list. That's not so hard, right? But making direct amends to people wherever possible, like literally going to people and saying, hey, when I was working for you, I padded my expense account. Or you go to your spouse and say, for the last 20 years, I've spent 80 hours a week at work and I haven't paid attention to us or to the kids. Step 9 is hard, right? You make this list and then you start going at it to make amends to people. But here's the deal. Like, this is, if you self-identify as a person of faith and there is nothing in the 12 steps that is not taught in Scripture. Nothing. There's nothing here that's inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. I mean, Jesus himself says, go out and be reconciled to other people. And when you screw things up, promptly admit it, This is just called adulting. It's called just be an adult. Go own your mistakes, clean your side of the street up, and and move through the world with that kind of wisdom, And the beautiful thing about the steps is it lays out exactly how to do it, and the context in which it's best done. And if you follow the directions, change will come.
Yeah. So how does bitterness, resentment, cynicism infect and affect and hijack this process, especially when, I don't know, we've experienced betrayal in a relationship, or just, I'm saying this as a one who's like Mr. Justice Warrior. I want payback. I want revenge. I want justice in this situation to be had, and I'm not seeing it. And yet the temptation of bitterness and cynicism and resentment and the withdrawal of my heart is there. How could that infect and affect this process? Let's just go here, the 12 steps toward healing and transformation, moving outside of ourselves. Like, what's your take on that?
So, for example, step 4 is you make a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself. So as you do that, things like skepticism, cynicism, bitterness, and resentment, they're all going to come out. They're all going to, if you do this step right, man, they're all going to come out. And then in step 5, you're going to go admit that to God, to yourself, and to another human being. Right? I'm a cynic. I'm a skeptic. I'm experienced betrayal. All this stuff. And then in 6 and 7, you're going to give those character defenses, or defects, as they like to say in the 12-step community that I'm a part of, over to God to remove them from you. And now that can take a hot minute, but it does. I've seen in many instances where those things have been taken away really quickly. And when you also begin to realize that many of your resentments you played a role in. So in the book, for example, I talk about like let's take an incident of betrayal. So when I was a little kid, I had when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I was sexually abused by some boys in our neighborhood. And now I didn't do anything in that situation that was wrong. And everything in me could have been, and for many years was, resentful. Like, I did nothing wrong. I was, a crime was perpetrated against me. But when I did the steps, I had this revelation that, oh, wait a minute. After the fact, many years forward, I continued to use that experience as an excuse for some of my unhealthy ways of being in the world. And so, what was my part in that situation? I learned how to play the victim card. And when I realized that, suddenly, it just, and by the way, this is really good news when you can figure out what your part is in every resentment. Because as long as it's always someone else's fault 100%, you have no power to change it. Right? But if you own your part, suddenly it's like, oh, I can actually do something about this. And I can be free of the snare of the resentment by when I see my piece of it. And that's a really important part.
You mentioned that just a second ago, and I'm curious about this. How do we dump the victim card? How do we relinquish, let go of, surrender the identity of victim? Because it's easy to adopt.
Oh, it's super easy. And it's understandable. So first of all, we begin with compassion, no blame. It's like, well, this is a way that my brain came up with to cope with whatever trauma it was that led to that interpretation of myself as being a victim. I love, the work of Carl Jung. And one of the things he talks about is this idea that, it's not what happened to you that matters. It's what you think happened to you. So in other words, it's the story that you tell yourself moving forward about that incident and how it defines you and what it told you about you in the world, right? And I think part of the job of adulting, of growing up spiritually, is going back and looking at the narratives that we've created around things that happened to us and to begin to rewrite that story. And again, the steps really help us to do that, right? Like, let me give you an example of this. Like, so my dad was an alcoholic and a drug addict. He died from it at age 63. Never saw a day of sobriety. My dad was also kind of a mentally ill dude, and so he was unable to have a level of honesty with himself that would make recovery possible. And, as I worked the steps, I began to realize, and as I did my own work around my relationship with him, I began to realize, oh, wait a minute. You know what? Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I want to have a mental illness and I want to be an alcoholic and a drug addict and really hurt my kids and have a lousy marriage and, struggle with my career my whole life because of it. Nobody gets up and does that, right? And so what began to arise in me as I worked the steps was empathy and compassion for him. Like, oh, you know what? This wasn't a choice on his part. And the way he treated me, it wasn't personal. It would have happened to anybody else who was born into the same situation, right? And I'm not giving him a hall pass for all the stuff that he did. All I'm saying is that I began to say, my dad was as sick as I am. And he was stumbling and doing the best he could with what he had. It wasn't much, but, that's the best thing he could come up with. And so what the steps do is it begins to defang a lot of our resentments and a lot of our pain and suffering in a way that brings peace and healing.
Yeah, what does that do for your psyche, your mental and emotional health when you can say, yeah, my dad is just as sick as I am? Again, you're not letting him off the hook, but what's happening?
Yeah, well, what's amazing is, like, for example, I have a friend of mine, and he had a terrible hip, and he refused to get surgery because he's really had a phobia around anesthesia and, getting cut. And but then eventually that hip caused him more pain than he was willing to live with anymore. And so there's an example, right, of where something causes you more pain that, he'd rather, okay, it's time to change, right? So he had the surgery, and then he came back to me and he was like, I can't believe I waited this long. I can't believe how much energy, how much life that pain sucked out of me for so many years walking around on a painful hip. And now I have all this energy and joy and freedom to do things I was unable to do before. And that's what happens when you defang some of this old material in your life through working the steps. You suddenly wake up and you're like, how did I live with that pain for so long? Like, I had no idea how much life it was sucking out of me. And now all of a sudden I have creativity and I have hope and I have a sense of joy about the future I didn't have before. I just didn't realize how much it was taking from me. And I've seen that plenty of times in my own life and also in the lives of others that I call my litter mates in my 12-step community.
So what's a spiritual workaround then? I connect that to, like, if we embrace the victim identity, you talk about spiritual workarounds, and I just am wondering if those are connected a little bit and how spiritual workarounds might hijack the process of transformation.
Well, I mean, like, addictions themselves are spiritual workarounds.
Okay, say more.
Right. Well, For example, I mean, when you engage in a unhealthy compulsive relationship with a person, a behavior, or a substance, it's to try and address and eradicate inner pain or dis-ease, right? And so without God's help, without God's involvement, that's a spiritual bypass, right? That's like saying, okay, I'm going to go around God and fix this myself. And again, it doesn't work, right? Well, what's difficult is in the beginning it works pretty well. But then the further on you get into the relationship, suddenly it develops an addictive quality. It becomes compulsive, and now it's a problem, right? So you have to begin this process of dismantling through the steps this old structure and to replace it with one that's better.
Yeah, and this is sort of the point I wanted to laser on today. Your point that addicts' problems are primarily spiritual, not psychological or moral. Tell me why.
Well, they're definitely not moral, right? I know that to be true. That's not the case. So Bill Wilson, the guy who wrote the 12 Steps himself, said that the problem of addiction of any kind is really is principally spiritual. So I don't want to downplay the physiology involved and the psychology. There's a lot of, again, like I said, it's a complicated process. So, but principally spiritual. In other words, what the steps are designed to do. So let me just tell you what they're designed to do. This is Bill Wilson who came up with them. This is what he said. It's also in the 12th step. The steps are designed to facilitate a spiritual awakening of sufficient force that it displaces and renders your need for an addictive substance, person, behavior. It just renders it unnecessary. That's all. So it facilitates a spiritual awakening of sufficient force that it renders your addictive pattern unnecessary. You no longer need to please everybody. You no longer need to take that drink. You no longer need to eat a pint of Ben & Jerry's at 2 o'clock in the morning to make your anxiety go away. You no longer need to control other people, places, and things, like over-control people, places, and things. You no longer, Chris, for you no longer need to be perfect in order to justify your existence and to find love and relationship in the world. You just don't need to do it anymore. You now have moved from an egocentric life to a theocentric life, from a self-centered life to a God-centered life. And now you have turned your will and your life over to the care of someone who can actually take care of this problem for you. And guess what? It expels the obsession with the behavior or the substance, and suddenly you find a new life.
I do want to ask you about fear before we land this plane today, but I want to make sure you've had the space and the time to unpack as much of the 12-step, the process that you've wanted. Is there anything else that we're missing or that you just really want to share with folks today, Ian? Like I said, I want to land the plane around fear, but I don't want to shortchange anything that you've had on your heart.
Yeah, so I think one really critical component in working the steps is you can do them yourself and you'll derive some benefits, so I don't want to downplay that. So you could go buy the book and the workbook, do it yourself, and get a lot out of it, right? But what really accelerates it and makes it a really rich and even at times fun process is doing it with a community. So, if you are a gambler or a spender or you're codependent or you've got some substance behavior problem, there's literally, Chris, hundreds of 12-step communities, hundreds of them that are based around the 12 steps that help people with different issues, right? You could literally get my book and the workbook and then also jump online and find a community that meets in your community or online and join it and get a sponsor and do the work, right? Now, if you're not ready to do that, and I get it if you're not, you could just get the workbook and get 2 or 3 friends or 4 friends and say, let's do this together. Like, let's go through the steps together. So the community component is really, really rich if you're willing to do it. Again, you can do it without it. You'll get something out of it, and I'd rather you do that than not do it at all. But the community aspect is really makes the process so much richer and stronger. And again, the book lays out how you can do that.
That's right. Well, I want to land here today. The problem with fear, your words, isn't simply that it's a sucky feeling. That hit me. It's that it activates the very character flaws we'd most like God to remove from our lives. That hits me and slices me in 6 different ways. Tell me more.
Yeah, so let's talk about, let's say you're a one that tends to be really critical of other people. And it's actually a very hypothetical. And actually it's something,
my friend.
And you've tried everything in your power to overcome on your own, because you know that being hypercritical of other people is not landing well with your partner or your kids, and you just can't give it up. You just, for some reason, it's just bigger than you are, okay? So we admit that we're powerless over our hypercritical addiction. We've come to believe that God can restore us to sanity, and we've turned our will and our life and that problem over to His care. Now, then, we keep moving through the steps, right? But when you get to steps like 6 and 7, and you start to realize, you know what, underneath this, like in step 5, we have a fear inventory in the workbook, right? Just write down all your fears, whatever they are. Write down your fear of people, places, institutions, principles, whatever it is. In my experience, all of my worst behaviors, if you really dig underneath them, what is driving them is fear. Fear is insanely powerful, right? And in your instance, or not necessarily yours, but hypothetically yours, right? So what's underneath that hypercriticalness, right? It's fear, right?
Ian, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and fear for many different reasons, right? But it's the fear of being wrong. It's and this need to be right. It's the fear that if things don't it's the fear that will arise if things aren't done correctly, right? The anxiety we feel when things aren't done right? So again, you just start to see this stuff and put it in the sunlight instead of letting it fester in the dark, right? Let's get this fear out on the page. Let's share it with other people. Let's begin to just acknowledge what's happening here. And so fear, takes people out all the time and actually continues to stoke the flames of our addictive patterns in ways that we really need to see and begin to address, to find the sort of, if you will, to be saved from it, really.
Fear stokes the flames of our addictive patterns. That's worth the price of admission today, Ian.
Yeah, it's interesting you should say that too, Chris, because one of the things the book tries to do, first of all, what's interesting about the book, I like to think that it's actually a really fun book to read. I mean, it's challenging, it's hard. However, I really tried to infuse it with some of my Irish humor, because actually the one of the things that surprises people when they go to 12-step meetings is they're nothing like what you see on TV. They're really fun. Like, there's a lot of laughter in the rooms, a lot of laughter. People are blown away by that when they first come. They're like, why are these people so happy? I thought this was going to be a glum thing to do. And actually, people aren't sitting around talking about the problem. They're sitting around talking about the solution. And that's really, really great, right? So, I just really believe that as you do the work, that the more you do it, the more you defrost, and you start to realize, oh, wait a minute, yeah, this is hard and it's painful at points, but there's so much joy as you go along because you're starting to witness transformation and healing in really profound ways. And so I, as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this and pretty stoked to get it into the hands of people who are really anxious and eager because they're out of ammo and they really want help.
Well, one of the things I'm encouraged by, and we'll just land here, your life is proof of this, and I'm so thankful. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for your vulnerability, Ian. Thank you for your willingness to invite others into the fold of this incredible journey called transformation. I honor you for it. I respect you even more for it. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for this just wonderful conversation. As always, you're a gem. I love it every time your name shows up on the calendar. And I'm just very, very, very thankful.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. I had a ball.
This message in particular is transformative, and I'm thankful for it.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.